You know, there are times when I wished I could move away from strict evidence, 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 and talk about how the resurrection is applied to everyday life. I mean, to give you, for me, certainly the most central illustration, I refer to my wife, Debbie, and her death in 1995 to stomach cancer. And we brought her home from the hospital, and she was up in the room sleeping for most of the day, and I had a child monitor up there, and I went out to sit on the porch, and I kind of had a discussion with the Lord, a make-believe discussion. What would the Lord say? And the discussion always went something like this. Lord, Debbie's only 43 years old, and I have these young children, and you did give me ministry. How can I take care of the kids and the clothes and the food and Lord, while I'm on this subject, why is Deb dying? And I pictured the Lord saying back to me, Gary, we've got something in common. I watched my son die. Now, at the time, I thought the only kinds of people who could share my pain, so to speak, were those who lost a spouse or a child. So this was a especially relevant response that I imagined God saying. And so when he said, I watched my son die, I imagine it sort of shocking me, sort of setting me back a little bit. And I'd say, yes, you did, didn't you? And he'd say, and so the Father, he kind of moves into that gap, and God says, I didn't rescue him from the cross, did I? Oh, no, you didn't. No, you didn't. Gary, he died. And I see what's coming, so I zip ahead and I picture my wife dying. I'm thinking, I can't deal with this. And he keeps coming, and he says, Gary, I watched my son die. Do you expect better treatment than my son received? I said, oh, Lord, I'm not worthy. No, Lord, you understand, I'm just hurting. I'm just hurting. He said, Gary, I understand. I watched my son die. And here's my promise. And generally, I think this is the promise in Scripture. I think generally God does not claim to take us from things. I think the claims, repeated claims in Scripture, our favorite verses, is to hold our hand through suffering. And he says, I was there for my son. Into your hands I commend my spirit, and I'll be with you. And that crushed me, because I realized if this comes out, then Debbie's going to die. And she did. So we kept talking. The Lord said, one more thing. What kind of a world is this? I said, I guess a world where you raised your son from the dead. What does that mean? Well, come on, Lord. That was 30 A.D. This is 1995. Why? And he says, Gary, you're avoiding the issue. Let's go back to my question. What kind of a world is this? It's a world where you raised your... But Lord, Debbie's up there. Gary. And at this point, I picture him reaching down and sort of grabbing my shirt collars and pulling me up close. And he says something like this. I know you've only got a PhD, so I'm going to say this real slowly. Read my lips. If this is a world where I raised my son from the dead, it's the same world in 30 A.D. as it is in 1995. The world is the same. It's a world where I'll hold your hand through suffering, and one day you'll be together. As a card that was sent to me that was most touching, I couldn't even repeat this card for probably a year. The card said, can you imagine what it will be like when one day you are in heaven and you'll be able to walk with your wife through the heavenly gardens, walking hand in hand? And I was unprepared for the Lord's answer, and I said, Lord, what are you saying to me? And he said, simple. I watched my son die. Do you expect better? No, Lord. What kind of a world is it? It's a world where you raise people from the dead. Hang in there. I'm going to be with you, but I'm not taking you from this one. And it crushed me. But that was an application of resurrection to my present needs. He hadn't promised to take me from, but he promised to hold my hand through. And it was strictly because of the hope of resurrection that we have a truth like St. Paul's, where he says we mourn, but not as those without hope. And I realized that mourning with hope, the hope of heaven, is way better than mourning without hope. And as painful as the lesson was, That's a lesson we learn from the resurrection of Jesus.